Today, we get to hear about one of my favorite people in the Bible, Elijah. Now, Elijah's successor I really like too, Elisha, and that gave me no end of confusion when I was little, trying to remember who was Elijah and who was Elisha. It's like, couldn't they have had a little bit more different names? And then, of course, Elijah's no Caleb, because Caleb, 90 years old, decides, hey, you know that land I was promised when we came into this place? I'm going to take it now. You're 90, so? It's great fun. But Elijah did some pretty cool stuff. I mean, he is largely considered to be the greatest of the prophets, something that's kind of given evidence to when, during the Transfiguration, remember who showed up with Jesus? Moses and Elijah. In fact, they used to set, and I think they might still do, at Passover, they set a place for Elijah just in case he should happen to come back. Because remember, Elijah is one of the two people in the Bible that didn't die. He was taken up into heaven. Anybody know who the other one is? Enoch. Jesus died. Everybody, it always catches people because they think anyways, that's neither here nor there. That's just a fun joke I like to play on people. So Elijah was a prophet in Israel during, a pretty terrible time. The king of Israel was a guy named Ahab, not peg leg and a whale Ahab, but king of Israel Ahab. He married a lady named Jezebel. And let's just say people are called Jezebels because of her. Together, they decided that they were going to stop paying attention to God and started to worship Baal and Asherah, two of the more popular Canaanite deities at the time. It's so bad that in 1 Kings 16, it says that Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all the kings of Israel before him, which is saying something considering how bad the kings of Israel tended to be. Now, Elijah shows up to the scene in 1 Kings 17, and the very first thing he does is he says, hey, guess what? God's going to stop the rain now. Now, this is particularly cute because it just so happens that Baal and Asherah are fertility gods, which means that they're kind of in charge of crops. And so it's kind of God poking a finger at the people that are worshiping Baal and Asherah and saying, hey, I bet the people you're worshiping can't bring the rain after I stopped it. Because God sometimes does fun things like that. At least I like to think God sometimes does fun things like that, especially when I look at creatures like the platypus. How can you not giggle at a platypus? I mean, really, it's just a fantastic animal. I kind of have weird animals on the brain because this past week, VBS's theme was weird animals, and there were a lot of, weird animals. So Elijah stops the rain, or says that God is stopping the rain, and after 3 years of no rain, can you imagine what life would be like if it didn't rain for 3 years? That would get a little intense. After 3 years, God says to Elijah, hey, guess what you're going to do today? You're going to show up at Ahab's front door, and you're going to have a chat at him. Now, what's fun is Elijah goes to the palace, of course, and then there's a guy at the palace that is still faithful to God, and he's like, no, Elijah, you can't go in there. If you go in there, Ahab is going to kill you. It's like, well, yeah, I'll be fine. No, he's going to kill you. It's like, no, it'll be okay, don't worry. So Elijah goes in, and he says, let's make a contest. Because everybody loves a contest, right? So Elijah shows up, and he says, you gather up all the prophets of Baal, and I'll gather up little old me. We're going to build 2 altars. We're going to put a sacrifice on it, and we're not going to light it, and we're going to see which God lights their altar on fire first. And that'll prove who's real and who isn't. As contests goes, it's fairly well thought out. I mean, if you're worshiping a supreme being, you would hope that they'll be able to spontaneously create fire, right? Well, the prophets of Baal start to pray, all 450 or so of them, and they start to pray, and they start to pray, and they start to pray, and Elijah starts to make fun of them because there's no fire, and they pray even harder, and Elijah makes fun of them even harder, Until finally Elijah says, okay, my turn now. So he gets a whole bunch of people. Says, hey, get me all the water you can find and dunk it on the altar. And they're, okay, so they get all the water, they dunk it on the altar. Now dig a little trench around the altar and then make sure all the water gets caught in the trench. So you got a trench full of water, you've got an altar made of stones, you've got some wood, and then you've got a sacrifice on top, and all of it's soaked. Now, how many of you have ever tried to start a fire with wood that's even the slightest bit damp? Not a pleasant experience. And this stuff's soaked. So Elijah basically says, hey, God, show everybody who you are. And, well, after a minute, there wasn't much left. The water all evaporated. The stones were burned up. The wood was burned up. The sacrifice was burned up. And at that point, everyone says, okay, God's real. We get it. And Elijah said, don't let those prophets of Baal escape. And there were 450 less prophets of Baal in Israel after that. Now, then you'd think that everything would be going well. At this point, Elijah looks out in the distance, and he's looking, and he sees rain clouds coming. He says to Ahab, there's going to be rain soon. Everything should be good, right? Until Ahab went home, and he told his wife what happened. And she was not pleased. So she said, oh, we got to get this Elijah guy. So Elijah did what anyone would do when someone's trying to kill him. He booked it. And he found himself in a cave, and he was just hanging out in the cave, and then God ended up sending some ravens to feed him, and then he went to another cave, and then we come across our reading for today, when God shows up and basically asks Elijah, what are you doing in this cave? And Elijah says, well, I'm the only one of your prophets left, and they're trying to kill me, so I'm going to hide in this cave for a while. Now, we would think it would be perfectly justified for Elijah to hide in this cave, right? Everybody's trying to kill him. He's trying to protect himself because he's the only prophet left. And what does God say? Get back to work. Have you ever been in that situation where you're just super frustrated with everything going on around you, and then somebody just shows up and doesn't give you any comfort at all and just says, work? You're kind of going, but I can't work. Nothing is working around me. How can I be expected to get anything done when everything is going wrong? But God says to Elijah, do your job. Anoint this guy, and anoint this guy. And, oh, by the way, almost as an afterthought, there are still 7,000 folk that haven't turned to Baal yet that I spared. And that's it. Now, what's interesting is it seems like the Christian church today is in this position of Elijah hiding out in the cave. We're frustrated because things are different. I mean, once upon a time, the questions you asked when you met someone used to be, who are you, where do you work, and where do you go to church, right? Nobody does that anymore. They still ask who are you and where do you work, but nobody asks where you go to church. It's just not something people are concerned about. In fact, it's so much so that people have started to decide that this is the post-Christendom era. See, for 1,200 years or so, it was called Christendom. Basically from the time when Constantine made Christianity not illegal, and then Theodosius made Christianity the official state religion of Rome, all the way up until, well, it kind of started to go downhill right about the Protestant Reformation, but even then it held on pretty good until early 20th century or so. Because the church was an integral part of everyone's daily life. The church had the power to say, oh, you broke one of the church laws, we're going to kill you now. The church had that kind of power. So it was the Christian kingdom, Christendom. Now, starting at the Reformation, that kind of power that the church held over people's lives started to wane, and in a lot of ways, the church has been fighting back against that for a really long time, but hasn't been doing a really good job. Because instead of, say, getting back to work and doing the stuff that God wants it to do, it's kept trying to do the stuff that it did when it was in Christendom. The church is still trying to tell people to follow its laws and to try to do the things that it says are right to do, but that's not, just because the church says it's the right thing to do doesn't mean God says it's the right thing to do. And so like Elijah, we're sometimes stuck in this place where we're feeling frustrated. We're frustrated because it feels like we're alone. It feels like with the world going crazy around us, we're losing things to hold on to. We're losing the things that made us comfortable, and we feel like we're the only prophet of God left. Because we live in a time now that people don't know the Bible stories that we grew up with. People don't know words like justification, sanctification, righteousness. They don't understand what any of those concepts are, if we even do anymore. And we're lucky if we come across someone who thinks that God isn't some hateful bearded guy trying to spoil everyone's fun. And yes, that is what people think about God. And I think because we're holding on to this Christendom model, we're missing out on opportunities. What if instead of trying to fit people into this church moral code, that we were actually showing them what Jesus was like? No one's ever been saved by a list of do thises and do thats. In fact, Luther tends to write that when we start to think that we can save ourselves by a list of do thises and do thats, we're just making it worse for ourselves. Because this is exactly what Paul is saying to the Romans. It's not about doing something that gets you in God's good graces. It's not about doing anything. But if you can believe in your heart and confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That's it. Now, if it's that easy, Paul actually foresaw this because that sounds too easy. But then Paul says, so, how can someone call on someone that they don't believe in? How can they believe in someone that they've never heard about? How can someone hear about someone if no one's preaching? And how can someone preach unless someone tells them to? It's easy to forget that we are the ones who are called to do the preaching. Not me sitting up here giving a sermon, but all of us. We are all sent by Jesus to tell the world about him. And not just to tell, but to show the world about him. To show people who have never heard who this Jesus guy is. So that we can be that example. So that we are the ones who show that God does love everyone. And because he loves everyone, that he sent his son to die for their sins so that they can be in a relationship together. So that everything that gets in the way of someone and God is gone. When we focus so much on sin, nobody wants to hear how terrible they are. When we focus on that list of rules, it starts to turn into a checklist. But it was never about that. So sometimes when we're frustrated, we do just need to hear that voice of God saying, keep at it. Keep going. Do what I have sent you to do. You are sent by God to preach so that someone out there can call on God and be saved. That's our job as believers. Because someone, sometime, was sent to preach to us. Someone somewhere told us these stories. Where would we be if we never heard about Jesus? Where might someone else be if they do? Now remember back to the parable of the sower? I know this was several weeks ago. You might have forgotten. But when you go out, sometimes it just doesn't work out quite right. So when you're frustrated, and you will be, just remember, what does God say to Elijah when he's frustrated? Keep going. Get back to work. Because, oh, by the way, you're not the only one left.